The driveway had always been the one place that felt unquestionably mine. It was concrete poured decades ago, framed by low stone edging and a line of mature trees that predated the HOA itself. Every crack, every oil stain, every faded leaf shadow told the quiet history of a property that had existed long before laminated rulebooks and clipboard inspections tried to rewrite reality. That morning began like every other, routine and unremarkable, the kind of calm that makes the shock hit harder when it finally comes. The sun was barely above the rooftops when I stepped outside, coffee still warm in my hand, expecting to see my truck exactly where I had parked it the night before. Instead, there was only empty pavement, pale tire marks, and a deep, immediate sense that something was very wrong. For a moment, the mind refused to accept it. The eyes scanned again, slower this time, searching for a shape that was no longer there. The silence of the driveway felt louder than any alarm. The realization settled in like a weight pressing down on the chest. My vehicle had been towed, taken from my own driveway on my own property without warning. In that instant, confusion turned into disbelief, and disbelief hardened into something colder. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate. The HOA had always been a presence, but until then it had been background noise. Letters slipped under doors about trash bins, passive-aggressive emails about lawn heights, color charts for shutters that no one actually followed. The kind of petty authority that thrives on being tolerated rather than challenged. There was one board member in particular who embodied that presence more than anyone else. The type who lingered too long during inspections, who spoke with the confidence of someone unused to hearing the word no. She had moved into the neighborhood years after I had, yet carried herself like she had personally built every house on the street. Over time, her influence had grown, and with it, her boldness. Neighbors whispered about fines issued without cause, warnings delivered selectively, enforcement that always seemed to land on the same few homes. It was power exercised not to maintain order, but to remind people who she thought was in control. I had never been a problem resident. My property was clean, maintained, compliant, which made what happened next impossible to explain through incompetence alone. This was escalation. The HOA notice came later that morning, taped crookedly to my mailbox, already curling at the edges from the heat. It cited a violation that didn't exist, referencing a rule that had been amended years earlier and no longer applied. According to the paper, my vehicle had been illegally parked overnight in a restricted area, a claim so absurd it bordered on parody. The restricted area, according to the HOA's own original documents, did not include private driveways. It never had. The paper carried the board member's signature, bold and confident, as if daring anyone to challenge it. That confidence was not accidental. It came from years of people backing down, of residents choosing peace over confrontation, of authority going unchecked simply because it wore an official-looking label. But this time, the move crossed a line that could not be ignored. This time, the target was not someone unfamiliar with systems of enforcement, contracts, and liability. This time, the board member had unknowingly stepped into a situation she did not understand. What she couldn't have known, what no one in the neighborhood really knew, was that towing wasn't just something I was familiar with. It was something I understood from the inside out. Years earlier, long before the HOA had flexed its influence this far, I had invested in a small towing operation. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't advertised locally. It operated quietly, efficiently, servicing commercial contracts, municipalities, and private properties across multiple districts. Ownership was deliberately structured through a holding company, the kind designed to keep business separate from personal life. There were reasons for that, reasons rooted in security, liability, and discretion. The name of the company wasn't common knowledge, and it certainly wasn't something an HOA board member would casually recognize. That separation was intentional. It was also about to become very relevant. When I contacted the number listed on the notice, the response confirmed what I already suspected. The tow had been authorized by the HOA, executed without a lawful basis, and carried out by a third-party company contracted by the board. A company that, ironically, operated within the same regional network as my own. A company whose licensing, insurance, and compliance history I was intimately familiar with. Every tow leaves a paper trail, and every paper trail leads somewhere. Board members' mistake wasn't just towing the vehicle. It was assuming that authority granted by an HOA letterhead outweighed property law, municipal codes, and contractual obligations. It was assuming the homeowner wouldn't push back. It was assuming wrong. As the day unfolded, word began to spread. Neighbors noticed the empty driveway. Questions circulated quietly, then more openly. Some expressed sympathy, others curiosity, a few fearfully distant, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. The board member, however, did not retreat. Instead, she doubled down. Additional notices were sent, fines threatened, deadlines imposed. The tone shifted from procedural to punitive, as if the goal was no longer compliance but submission. That escalation revealed something important. This wasn't about parking. It was about asserting dominance. And dominance, once challenged, often collapses under its own weight. Behind the scenes, documents were being gathered. Property deeds, HOA bylaws, amended rules, timestamped photographs, towing authorization forms. Each piece alone told part of the story. Together, they painted a picture of overreach that could not be explained away. The tow company's authorization log didn't match the HOA's claim. The board member's signature appeared where it legally shouldn't have. Insurance requirements had been bypassed. Notice periods ignored. What had been intended as a show of power was rapidly becoming evidence. Evidence that didn't just suggest misconduct, but pointed toward something far more serious. Conflict of interest, abuse of authority, potential fraud. By the end of the day, the board member was still confident, still issuing statements, still insisting the tow was valid. She had no idea that the company she hired was about to receive a compliance inquiry that would freeze its operations temporarily. No idea that her actions were being reviewed not just by attorneys, but by regulatory bodies who cared very little about HOA politics. No idea that the driveway she tried to control was connected to a business that understood exactly how towing laws were meant to function and how badly hers had just been violated. The neighborhood, meanwhile, stood on the edge of something larger than a missing truck. What began as a petty act of intimidation was unraveling into a situation that would expose years of unchecked behavior. And this was only the beginning. By the following morning, the disappearance of my vehicle had stopped being a personal inconvenience and had begun transforming into something far more consequential. A slow-burning situation that revealed just how fragile the HOA's authority truly was when exposed to scrutiny. While the board member continued issuing notices and asserting control through emails and paper warnings, I moved quietly and methodically, understanding that overreaction would only dilute the impact of what was already unfolding. The retrieval process itself became the first crack in the facade. When I arrived at the impound lot, the paperwork presented to justify the tow was riddled with inconsistencies that would have been invisible to most people, but stood out immediately to anyone familiar with towing regulations. The authorization form lacked a valid property boundary reference. The timestamp conflicted with surveillance footage from nearby homes, and the listed violation code had been obsolete for years. Each error compounded the last, creating a chain of procedural failure that no amount of posturing could fix. I paid the release fee without argument, not because I accepted the legitimacy of the tow, but because I understood the value of preserving evidence intact. Every receipt, every signature, every internal log entry mattered. The truck was returned to my driveway by midday, its absence now replaced by something heavier than anger, a sense of inevitability. The HOA board member had not just crossed a line. She had unknowingly triggered mechanisms that did not operate on emotion or intimidation, but on documentation and liability. Throughout the neighborhood, curiosity intensified. Residents who had once avoided eye contact now lingered, asking indirect questions, sharing stories of fines they had quietly paid, warnings they had never challenged. Patterns emerged, revealing a selective enforcement strategy that consistently targeted properties without legal sophistication or financial leverage. This tow had been intended as a warning shot, but instead it became a spotlight. Meanwhile, the board member interpreted my silence as submission. Additional penalties were drafted, enforcement timelines shortened, and a notice of potential lien was circulated, a move so aggressive it bordered on reckless. What she failed to realize was that each escalation expanded the scope of her exposure. Behind closed doors, the HOA's contracted management company began asking questions, requesting clarification, seeking documentation that the board member struggled to produce. Emails grew defensive, explanations vague, responsibility subtly deflected. At the same time, the towing company involved received an unexpected compliance inquiry, one that paused new HOA-authorized tows pending review. This was not coincidence. It was the natural consequence of irregular authorization practices colliding with regulatory oversight. The inquiry alone carried weight, forcing internal audits and temporarily freezing revenue streams. Pressure mounted quietly, invisibly, while the board member continued projecting certainty outwardly. She attended inspections, walked the neighborhood, issued verbal warnings, all while unaware that her actions were being logged not just by me, but by agencies far removed from HOA politics. Property law does not bend to personality, and towing statutes do not care about perceived authority. As the days passed, the initial shock of the tow gave way to something more strategic. Neighbors began forwarding copies of notices they had received, comparing language, dates, and signatures. Same name appeared repeatedly, often on actions that bypassed proper board votes or violated the HOA's own bylaws. What had once seemed like isolated incidents now formed a documented pattern of unilateral decision-making. The board members' confidence, once bolstered by compliance and silence, now existed in a vacuum. She had no idea that her paper trail was growing thicker by the hour, or that the very act she considered routine had activated legal protections she could not override. Even the HOA's legal counsel, when quietly approached for clarification on towing authority, provided cautious responses that stopped short of endorsement. That hesitation spoke volumes. The neighborhood itself began to shift, tension replacing complacency, whispers replacing acceptance. People sensed that something irreversible was underway, though few understood its full scale. From the outside, it still looked like a simple parking dispute, a petty HOA drama destined to fizzle out. Internally, however, the structure was straining under its own weight. The board members' authority depended entirely on the assumption that no one would challenge it with precision. That assumption was gone. The tow had failed to intimidate, instead it had exposed. And as documentation continued to surface and oversight tightened, it became clear that this was no longer about reclaiming a vehicle or disputing a fine. It was about accountability, about the consequences of treating power as personal property. The stage was set for confrontation not through shouting or spectacle, but through records, statutes, and the kind of leverage that cannot be undone once applied. The driveway was full again, but the neighborhood would never return to the quiet compliance it once knew because the process had already begun, and it was moving forward whether the HOA was ready or not. As the third week unfolded, the situation entered a phase that no longer felt reactive but inevitable, as though events were now moving along a track laid down years earlier by unchecked decisions and quiet abuses that had finally reached their limit. The HOA board members' authority, once reinforced by routine compliance and a lack of resistance, began to show visible strain, not through open confrontation but through hesitation, contradiction, and procedural missteps that compounded with each passing day. The neighborhood itself seemed to sense the shift, operating with a subdued awareness that something structural was happening beneath the surface. Notices were still issued, inspections still conducted, but their impact had dulled. Residents no longer responded with immediate compliance. Requests for documentation increased. Deadlines were questioned. Appeals were filed. The administrative machinery that once functioned smoothly through fear and habit now slowed under the weight of scrutiny. At the center of it all, the board member continued acting as if escalation equaled control, unaware that escalation without legitimacy only accelerates collapse. Behind the scenes, the towing incident had become a reference point, a concrete example that made abstract complaints tangible. It was no longer about hypothetical overreach. It was about a documented act that violated property law, municipal towing regulations, and the HOA's own governing documents simultaneously. That convergence made the situation uniquely dangerous for those responsible. The towing company's internal audit progressed, uncovering authorization discrepancies tied directly to the HOA's requests. Each discrepancy triggered additional reporting requirements, expanding oversight beyond what anyone involved had anticipated. Regulatory frameworks are designed to widen when resistance appears, and that widening effect had begun. Meanwhile, the HOA's management company, increasingly uncomfortable with its position, initiated a compliance review of recent enforcement actions. This review, framed as routine, quietly examined notices, fines, and authorizations issued over the past 2 years. Patterns emerged quickly. Enforcement actions clustered around specific properties. Board votes were missing from records where votes were required. Emergency authorities were invoked without qualifying conditions. What had once been dismissed as assertive leadership now read unmistakably as unilateral control. The board members' emails, once curt and authoritative, shifted tone, growing defensive, verbose, and inconsistent. Explanations contradicted earlier statements. Timelines shifted, responsibility blurred. These were not signs of confidence, they were signs of pressure. In the neighborhood, conversations changed character. Where there had once been whispered frustration, there was now coordinated caution. Residents began attending meetings not to argue but to observe. Notes were taken, recordings requested. Procedural questions were raised calmly, persistently, and with increasing sophistication. The board member responded by tightening control, restricting agenda items, limiting discussion, and invoking rules selectively to silence dissent. Each attempt to suppress transparency only drew more attention to what was being concealed. Transparency, once demanded, does not recede easily. Meanwhile, the towing incident continued to ripple outward. Insurance carriers took notice, requesting clarification on liability exposure. Underwriters do not tolerate ambiguity, and ambiguity was all the HOA could offer. The potential for claims, both individual and collective, became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a single resident's grievance, it was a systemic risk. The board member, still unaware of the full scope, began shifting blame publicly, framing the tow as a misunderstanding caused by miscommunication. That narrative unraveled quickly when documentation surfaced showing direct authorization, explicit instruction, and repeated follow-up. The record was unambiguous. Attempts to minimize responsibility only reinforced the perception of misconduct. As pressure mounted, the HOA's legal counsel advised restraint, recommending suspension of enforcement actions pending review. That recommendation was ignored. The board member, accustomed to unilateral decision-making, interpreted caution as weakness. She continued issuing notices, threatening liens, and asserting authority with increasing urgency. Urgency, however, is not legitimacy. Each unauthorized action expanded liability, each ignored warning compounded exposure. The neighborhood's mood shifted from anxiety to anticipation. People sensed that resolution was approaching, not through confrontation but through consequence. The tow that had been intended to intimidate now served as a catalyst, a clear inflection point that transformed passive dissatisfaction into active accountability. Behind closed doors, preparations continued quietly. Documentation was organized, timelines reconstructed, jurisdictional boundaries clarified. Ownership structures, once irrelevant, now mattered deeply. The separation between personal property and business interest, carefully maintained for years, remained intact, but its relevance loomed large. The board member had assumed she was dealing with a typical homeowner dispute, unaware that the mechanisms she had activated intersected with regulatory systems far beyond the HOA's reach. That assumption proved fatal to her strategy. By the end of the third week, the HOA's internal cohesion had begun to fracture. Board members questioned decisions they had previously endorsed without scrutiny. Attendance wavered. Confidence eroded. The narrative of control could no longer be sustained when confronted with evidence, oversight, and collective awareness. The driveway, once the silent stage for an act of intimidation, now stood as a symbol of unintended consequence. The vehicle parked there represented not just reclaimed property, but the permanence of records, the endurance of law, and the reality that authority without accountability eventually consumes itself. The situation had passed the point where quiet resolution was possible. What lay ahead was exposure, formal review, and outcomes that could not be negotiated away. The process had momentum now, and momentum, once established, does not stop for those who created it. By the time the fourth chapter of this situation began to take shape, the HOA no longer felt like a unified governing body, but like a structure held together by habit and denial, its cracks widening with every attempt to pretend nothing was wrong. The towing incident, once framed as a minor enforcement action, had now become a reference point in nearly every internal discussion, an unspoken acknowledgement that the board had crossed into territory it did not understand and could not easily retreat from. The board member at the center of it all continued to project certainty, but her certainty was no longer contagious. Other board members began distancing themselves subtly, missing meetings, abstaining from votes, requesting that certain decisions be postponed or documented more thoroughly. These were small acts of self-preservation, signals that confidence in leadership had eroded. The management company, caught between contractual obligation and regulatory exposure, shifted from passive administration to defensive documentation. Emails became formal, language precise, disclaimers frequent. Requests for authorization were no longer accepted verbally or informally. Everything required written confirmation, and written confirmation was exactly what the board member struggled to provide. The paper trail she had once relied on now worked against her, each hastily signed notice adding to a growing archive of questionable actions. In the neighborhood, the atmosphere changed from tense to alert. Residents began attending meetings not out of frustration, but out of curiosity, sensing that they were witnessing the unraveling of something that had long operated without oversight. The board member responded by tightening procedural control, limiting public comment, restricting agenda items, and invoking rules selectively to shut down uncomfortable questions. These efforts only reinforced the perception that transparency was being avoided. Transparency, once demanded, becomes relentless. Meanwhile, the towing company's compliance inquiry escalated, moving beyond internal review into external reporting requirements. Regulatory frameworks do not pause for convenience, and the inconsistencies uncovered triggered mandatory notifications that expanded oversight beyond what the HOA could influence. Insurance carriers took notice, requesting clarification on exposure and risk mitigation. Underwriters are intolerant of uncertainty, and the HOA's inability to provide clear, lawful justification for enforcement actions raised immediate concerns. Premium adjustments, coverage limitations, and reservation of rights notices entered the conversation, introducing financial consequences that could not be dismissed as hypothetical. The board member, still operating under the assumption that authority could override process, attempted to reframe the situation publicly as a misunderstanding amplified by resistance. That narrative collapsed under the weight of documentation. Authorization forms contradicted statements. Time stamps conflicted with inspection logs. Enforcement actions bypassed mandatory steps outlined in the HOA's governing documents. Each contradiction chipped away at credibility, not just hers but the board's as a whole. Other board members, sensing the shifting ground, began consulting independent counsel, quietly and individually, seeking clarity on personal liability. That quiet consultation spoke louder than any public dissent. Liability, once abstract, had become personal. In response, the board member escalated again, issuing warnings of legal action against residents who questioned enforcement. These threats, delivered without formal backing, only accelerated scrutiny. Residents requested records formally, invoking statutory rights that required timely response. Deadlines loomed. Extensions were denied. The administrative burden grew heavier by the day. What had once been a manageable flow of compliance now resembled a flood of accountability. The towing incident continued to loom large, not because of its immediate impact, but because it represented a clear, undeniable breach of authority. It was tangible, documented, and legally significant. Unlike subjective disputes over aesthetics or noise, this was a matter of property law and regulated industry standards. The board members' failure to recognize that distinction early on had allowed the situation to metastasize. Behind the scenes, preparations continued with quiet precision. Timelines were reconstructed, ownership structures reviewed, jurisdictional boundaries clarified. The separation between personal and business interests, once merely a matter of privacy, now served as a safeguard against accusations of impropriety. That separation would soon become relevant in ways the board member could not anticipate. As the HOA struggled to maintain normal operations, cracks widened into fractures. Routine decisions stalled. Quorum became harder to achieve. Trust evaporated. The neighborhood watched, not with glee, but with a sense of vindication mixed with apprehension. The realization settled in that what was unfolding would not end quietly. The board member's authority, once unquestioned, now existed under relentless examination. Every action, every email, every notice carried potential consequence. The system she had relied on to enforce control now demanded accountability in return. The driveway, unchanged in appearance, had become symbolic of that reversal. It stood as a reminder that ownership, law, and process ultimately outweigh intimidation. The situation had reached a point where outcomes would be determined not by who spoke the loudest, but by who had respected the boundaries of authority in the first place. And as the fourth chapter closed, it became clear that the most consequential revelations were still ahead, waiting for the moment when the full scope of the board members' overreach would finally be impossible to deny. By the time the fifth chapter began, the situation had crossed a threshold where denial was no longer sustainable, even for those who had benefited most from silence. The HOA's internal communications grew frantic beneath their polished surface, revealing an organization struggling to reconcile its public posture with the reality closing in around it. What had once been framed as routine enforcement now demanded explanations that could withstand scrutiny outside the neighborhood, and those explanations did not exist. The board member at the center of the controversy, continued to operate as if persistence alone could rewrite the record, issuing clarifications that contradicted earlier statements, revising timelines, and attempting to retroactively legitimize actions that had already been documented as unauthorized. Each attempt to repair the narrative only exposed how fragile it had always been. The towing incident, now referenced explicitly in internal emails and legal memoranda, had become the pivot point around which everything else turned. It was no longer just an example of overreach. It was the catalyst that forced a broader examination of authority, procedure, and liability. The management company, increasingly concerned about its own exposure, began distancing itself through formal advisories, carefully worded notices that placed responsibility squarely back on the board. Administrative support shifted from facilitation to preservation, ensuring that records were retained, communications archived, and instructions documented. This shift was subtle but unmistakable. It signaled that the management company was preparing for scrutiny, not resolution. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's response matured from observation to coordination. Residents who had once felt isolated in their grievances now recognized a shared pattern, and that recognition fostered collective caution rather than impulsive rebellion. Requests for records multiplied, each invoking statutory timelines that the HOA struggled to meet. Delays accumulated. Responses grew incomplete. Omissions became obvious. The board members' authority, once exercised through speed and certainty, now faltered under the administrative weight of accountability. Every unanswered request became its own liability. Insurance carriers, no longer content with reassurances, escalated their inquiries, requesting detailed explanations of enforcement authority, towing authorization protocols, and conflict of interest safeguards. These requests were not optional. They carried deadlines and they required accuracy. The inability to respond confidently introduced the specter of coverage limitations, a risk that struck at the HOA's financial core. Board members who had previously deferred to the dominant personality now found themselves confronting uncomfortable questions about personal exposure. Quiet consultations with independent counsel became more frequent. Attendance at meetings became inconsistent. Abstentions increased. The illusion of unity dissolved into cautious self-preservation. In response, the board member attempted to consolidate control, pushing through resolutions without full discussion, asserting emergency authority where none existed, and framing dissent as obstruction. These maneuvers only accelerated the unraveling. Emergency authority invoked without justification carries consequences, particularly when used to bypass established safeguards. The towing incident's documentation, now fully compiled, painted a picture that could not be dismissed as error. Authorization forms bore signatures where signatures should not have been sufficient. Notices lacked required lead times. The cited violations referenced provisions that no longer applied. Each defect alone was serious. Together, they formed a narrative of systemic disregard for process. The board members' attempts to minimize these issues publicly contrasted sharply with the gravity assigned to them privately by advisors and insurers. That contrast eroded credibility further. The neighborhood felt the shift. Where there had once been anxiety about retaliation, there was now cautious confidence rooted in knowledge. Residents understood that the HOA's power depended entirely on compliance with its own rules and the law, and that power evaporated when those boundaries were crossed. The driveway, still ordinary in appearance, had become emblematic of that realization. It represented a boundary that had been violated and then defended, not through confrontation but through adherence to documented reality. Behind the scenes, preparations advanced with deliberate care. Ownership structures, once irrelevant to neighborhood politics, were reviewed to ensure clarity and separation. Jurisdictional maps were examined, regulatory frameworks revisited. The towing company's compliance inquiry progressed toward formal findings, each step increasing pressure on all parties involved. What had begun as an attempt to intimidate a homeowner now threatened to expose years of unchecked behavior, not just by one board member, but by a system that had allowed concentration of authority without oversight. As the fifth chapter drew to a close, the HOA found itself suspended between past and future, unable to return to the complacency that had enabled overreach, yet unprepared to confront the consequences of its actions openly. The board members' confidence, once unassailable, now appeared brittle, maintained through repetition rather than legitimacy. The neighborhood watched with a mix of relief and apprehension, aware that resolution would not come quietly or quickly. The machinery of accountability, once activated, does not reverse itself. It advances methodically, indifferent to personalities or positions. And as the evidence continued to accumulate, it became increasingly clear that the most damaging revelations were no longer hypothetical. They were imminent, waiting only for the moment when formal proceedings would force them into the open and transform this dispute from an internal crisis into a public reckoning that no amount of authority could contain. By the sixth chapter, the situation had reached a stage where momentum no longer belonged to any individual, but to the process itself, a slow, grinding force driven by documentation, timelines, and obligations that could not be postponed or reframed away. What had once been a localized HOA dispute now operated on multiple levels simultaneously, each one amplifying the consequences of the last. The board member at the center of the storm continued to behave as though authority was something that could be asserted until it became true, but the environment around her had changed irreversibly. The management company's tone shifted again, this time from cautious distancing to formal disengagement from certain enforcement activities, citing unresolved compliance concerns and pending reviews. That disengagement was subtle in language but severe in implication, signaling that the HOA was now operating without the administrative shield it had relied on for years. Without that buffer, every action taken by the board carried direct exposure. Internally, communications grew fragmented. Board members began communicating in smaller groups, excluding the dominant figure when possible, seeking consensus on how to limit damage rather than how to project strength. These conversations were not about vindication or control, but about survival, both institutional and personal. The towing incident continued to loom over every discussion, its significance expanding as more details surfaced. The compliance inquiry into the towing company moved toward formal findings, and with those findings came mandatory disclosures that could not be contained within private correspondence. Authorization records were cross-checked against HOA minutes, municipal ordinances, and state regulations, revealing gaps that no amount of explanation could bridge. Each gap represented not just error but responsibility. Insurance carriers responded accordingly, issuing reservation of rights notices that fundamentally altered the HOA's risk landscape. Coverage that had once been assumed was now conditional, contingent on outcomes that were increasingly out of the board's control. Financial projections, once stable, became uncertain. Assessments were discussed quietly, not as a certainty but as a possibility, and that possibility alone unsettled residents who had never imagined bearing the cost of leadership's overreach. The board member, sensing control slipping away, attempted to reassert dominance through procedural maneuvers, invoking emergency meetings, restricting access to records, and issuing broad directives intended to demonstrate authority. These actions had the opposite effect. Emergency declarations without substantiation attracted scrutiny. Restricted access triggered statutory responses. Broad directives invited challenge. The systems designed to protect homeowners against abuse of authority activated precisely because those safeguards were being tested. Residents, now better informed and increasingly coordinated, responded with measured persistence. Formal requests were filed, deadlines enforced. Responses evaluated not for tone but for substance. Each failure to comply compounded liability. The neighborhood's emotional tenor shifted again, moving beyond anticipation into resolve. Fear had been replaced by certainty, the certainty that the HOA's power was finite and conditional, and that those conditions had been violated. Behind the scenes, preparations advanced toward formal action. Documentation that had once been collected defensively was now organized proactively, structured for review by external parties rather than internal debate. Timelines were refined to the hour. Cross-references established. The separation between personal property ownership and business interests, once merely prudent, now served as a critical distinction in evaluating conflict of interest exposure. That distinction would soon become unavoidable. The board member had never considered that the industry she attempted to weaponize against a homeowner operated under stringent regulatory oversight, or that those regulations intersected with ownership structures designed precisely to prevent misuse. Her assumption that towing was a blunt instrument of intimidation proved catastrophically flawed. As the sixth chapter progressed, the HOA's internal cohesion continued to erode. Quorum became increasingly difficult to achieve as board members weighed the risk of association against the obligation to govern. Votes were postponed. Decisions deferred. Silence replaced confidence. The board member's once dominant presence now felt isolating, her certainty unshared, her insistence increasingly out of step with reality. The driveway, unchanged and unremarkable in appearance, had become a fixed point of reference, a reminder that authority ends at property lines defined by law rather than preference. It symbolized the moment when the HOA's assumed power met an immovable boundary. As regulatory deadlines approached and findings neared completion, the sense of inevitability intensified. There would be no quiet resolution, no internal compromise that could unwind the record. The processes in motion were designed to conclude, not negotiate. Each step forward narrowed the range of outcomes, transforming uncertainty into consequence. The board member continued to issue statements, but their audience dwindled. Credibility, once lost, does not return through repetition. It returns, if at all, through accountability. And accountability was no longer a theoretical threat. It was approaching, structured, formalized, and indifferent to personal narratives. By the end of the 6th chapter, it was clear that the dispute had transcended its origin entirely. What began as an act of intimidation had evolved into a comprehensive examination of governance, authority, and responsibility. The HOA stood at the edge of exposure not because of a single toe, but because that toe revealed everything beneath it. The next phase would not be defined by speculation or preparation, but by action, and those actions would force truths into the open that could no longer be deferred or denied. By the 7th chapter, the situation had shifted decisively from internal unraveling to external confrontation, the kind that strips away narratives and replaces them with findings, filings, and consequences that cannot be negotiated behind closed doors. What had once been managed through emails, meetings, and quiet advisories now moved into formal channels governed by deadlines and authority far beyond the HOA's reach. The compliance inquiry into the towing company concluded its preliminary phase, triggering mandatory disclosures that rippled outward with precision. Findings were issued, not as accusations, but as documented determinations grounded in regulatory standards that left no room for interpretation. The authorization for the tow was declared invalid. The process by which it had been ordered was deemed non-compliant. The responsibility for that failure was traced not to ambiguity, but to explicit instruction. That distinction mattered. It transformed the event from a procedural mistake into an act of overreach with identifiable origin. Once those findings entered the record, they could not be contained. Insurance carriers responded swiftly, adjusting positions, narrowing coverage, and signaling that defense costs related to unauthorized enforcement actions might not be indemnified. That single shift altered the HOA's posture overnight. Financial risk, once abstract, became immediate. Board members who had hesitated quietly now faced the reality that continued association carried personal implications. Resignations were discussed privately, then openly. Attendance at meetings dropped sharply. Quorum, already fragile, collapsed entirely at one point, forcing cancellations that underscored the loss of functional governance. The board member at the center of it all continued to insist on legitimacy, but her insistence now existed in isolation, unsupported by counsel, insurers, or administrators. The management company formally limited its role, issuing written notice that certain enforcement actions would no longer be administered pending resolution of compliance concerns. That limitation was not symbolic. It removed the operational infrastructure the board had relied on to exercise control. Without it, authority became theoretical rather than actionable. Meanwhile, residents, now fully aware that the process favored documentation over intimidation, maintained disciplined restraint. There were no confrontations, no emotional appeals, no public spectacle. Instead, there was persistence. Records requests were followed up precisely. Responses were evaluated for completeness. Deficiencies were noted and addressed through proper channels. This measured approach proved devastatingly effective. It left no opportunity to dismiss concerns as hostility or misunderstanding. Everything was framed in the language of compliance, governance, and statutory obligation. Behind the scenes, preparations advanced toward formal proceedings that would bring the dispute into a public forum where authority would be measured solely by adherence to law. Ownership structures that had once seemed irrelevant to neighborhood politics now became central to understanding conflict of interest exposure. The realization surfaced slowly among remaining board members that the towing incident had intersected with an industry subject to strict oversight, and that the homeowner involved possessed an understanding of those systems that far exceeded anything the HOA had anticipated. That realization bred a new kind of fear, not of retaliation, but of inevitability. Processes once triggered do not pause simply because their implications grow uncomfortable. The board members' attempts to reframe events publicly grew increasingly strained, relying on repetition rather than evidence. Statements emphasized intention rather than outcome, authority rather than compliance. They failed to resonate. Credibility, once eroded, does not regenerate under pressure. It collapses. As the seventh chapter progressed, formal notices began arriving, not from residents, but from external bodies seeking clarification, documentation, and response. These notices carried deadlines that could not be extended casually. Each required accuracy, completeness, and candor. The HOA's ability to respond coherently diminished with each request. Records were incomplete. Timelines conflicted. Authority was asserted where none existed. The gaps became impossible to ignore. The board member, now effectively isolated, faced the consequences of unilateral decision-making in a system designed to distribute responsibility. What had once felt like control now revealed itself as exposure. The neighborhood observed this phase with a quiet sense of closure approaching. There was no celebration, no vindictive satisfaction. Only the recognition that accountability, when delayed long enough, arrives with greater force. The driveway, still unchanged, remained the silent origin point of everything that followed. It stood as a reminder that property rights are not granted by committees, and that authority exercised without restraint eventually confronts boundaries it cannot cross. As the seventh chapter drew toward its end, it became clear that resolution was no longer a matter of negotiation or internal reform. It would come through formal determination, through findings that would define responsibility clearly and publicly. The remaining question was no longer whether consequences would follow, but how extensive they would be, and how many years of unchecked behavior would be illuminated in the process. The final chapter loomed not as a dramatic showdown, but as a reckoning shaped by records, rulings, and the quiet certainty that systems built to protect against abuse ultimately fulfill that purpose, regardless of how long it takes. By the time the final chapter unfolded, the outcome no longer felt dramatic so much as inevitable, the natural conclusion of a process that had been set in motion the moment authority was mistaken for immunity. What remained was not tension, but clarity, the kind that strips events down to their documented core and leaves no room for reinterpretation. Formal determinations arrived in sequence, each one narrowing the narrative until only facts remained. Regulatory findings confirmed that the tow had been unauthorized, improperly documented, and executed in violation of both municipal ordinance and state towing statutes. The HOA's attempt to justify the action retroactively failed under review, not because of intent, but because intent is irrelevant where compliance is required. The responsibility was assigned precisely, tracing the authorization directly to the board member who had signed the order and issued follow-up instructions without lawful basis. That trace mattered. It removed ambiguity. It eliminated collective deflection. It transformed what had been framed as a board decision into an individual act carried out under the appearance of authority rather than its reality. Insurance carriers responded accordingly, issuing final coverage determinations that excluded defense and indemnification for actions deemed willful and noncompliant. The financial consequences crystallized overnight. Legal costs that might once have been absorbed by the HOA now became personal exposure. The board member's position collapsed under that weight. Resignation followed, not as an admission of wrongdoing, but as a recognition that the structure could no longer support her presence. Other board members followed in rapid succession, distancing themselves from a record that had grown too heavy to share. The HOA, stripped of leadership and administrative backing, entered a period of forced restructuring under external guidance. Special meetings were called, overseen rather than controlled, focused not on enforcement but on remediation. Residents watched with a quiet sense of finality, understanding that what was ending was not just a tenure, but a pattern. The legal proceedings that followed did not rely on spectacle or emotion. They relied on documentation assembled patiently over weeks, records preserved precisely because no one rushed to confrontation. The tow receipt, the authorization forms, the internal emails, the bylaws, the amended rules, the surveillance timestamps, all aligned into a narrative that required no embellishment. And then came the detail that recontextualized everything. Ownership records were entered into the record, not as a surprise, but as a clarification. The towing company involved in the incident operated within a regional network subject to oversight that intersected directly with a holding entity I controlled. That control did not create the violation, it revealed it. The separation between personal property and business interest had been deliberate, lawful, and transparent where required, but it also meant that the tow had triggered internal compliance mechanisms that no external contractor could suppress. The board members' attempt to weaponize towing as intimidation had inadvertently activated an industry that does not tolerate irregularity, especially when documentation is incomplete and authorization defective. The conflict of interest she had accused others of wielding was, in reality, her own. By ordering an unauthorized tow, she had exposed herself not only to civil liability but to regulatory scrutiny that extended far beyond the HOA. The lawsuit that followed was not framed as revenge. It was framed as remedy. It sought reimbursement, declaratory relief, and injunctive protection, not just for one homeowner, but to prevent repetition of the same abuse under new leadership. The settlement discussions reflected that posture. They were structured, measured, and grounded in evidence. Terms were reached that required policy changes, external oversight, financial restitution, and formal acknowledgement of overreach. No dramatic courtroom moment was needed. The record spoke clearly enough. As the final documents were signed and filed, the neighborhood entered a new phase, quieter but more stable, governed by rules applied as written rather than as wielded. The driveway returned to what it had always been, just a driveway, no longer symbolic, no longer contested. The truck parked there became ordinary again, but the lesson lingered. Authority borrowed legitimacy until it exhausted it. Power exercised without restraint invited systems larger than itself to intervene. What began as a simple act of intimidation ended as a comprehensive exposure, not because anyone shouted louder, but because patience allowed the truth to surface intact. In the end, the HOA did not fall because it was challenged. It fell because it forgot that its authority was conditional, and conditions, once violated, do not bend to confidence or denial. They respond only to accountability, and accountability, once engaged, always finishes what it starts.